Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. This is Three Men in a Boat with my erstwhile colleagues, Axel, Jacob, and Chuck Farr. We are going to talk about the situation in Ukraine. Hello, friends.
Good to see you, Scott. I see you are in our state-of-the-art studio somewhere in the Midwest of the United States.
Yes,
studio.
hiding from snow, which happened after our 70 degrees day of the St. Patrick's Day parade yesterday. So weather weirdness where I am.
Yeah, and just to not to be mistaken, I am, and for those on Twitter who can't see us, you can also, of course, follow us on YouTube on IWI, and we'll tell you all about it. I'm obviously here in green, not because of St. Patrick's Day, sorry, Scott, but the team which leads still 108-98, and that's the Green Bay Packers. And that's enough football lore for today.
Yes, I'm not going to follow up on that comment, although I could.
Yeah. Well, the people who last had any chance of winning anything in the mid-1980s. But there you go. Before I turn back to my fridge and grab myself a beer rather than eat it all up, Chuck, Scott, thank you very much for being here with us. And thanks also to all the people who are now trying to actually log on Twitter, as I can see, because we're doing a world's first today. We tried this a little while ago. We thought this might work because we've already done, of course, just like our friend Jonathan Fink, also on the IWI platform, a lot of live spaces or live to tape, if you so like. And we've recorded a few. But what we didn't yet manage to get is a proper way for the audience to ask questions and actually feed into this. And we're trying to do this today with the kind assistance of our magic Dane, the Thomas the Viking in the background, to make sure that if and when we come to, say, a set of questions later during the program, you'd be able to actually raise your hand on Twitter, come up as a speaker, ask your question.
Well, I always say something, whether I'm informed or not, so. Yep, absolutely, just fine.
Okay, good. Chuck, Scott has been writing a few things recently. You wrote a number of articles. You've had a number of interviews on Kiev Post. All of this in parallel to the evolving story of the, shall we say, pivot in U.S. foreign policy, the designs of a transactional presidential administration, which for a lot of Europeans and Ukrainians seem to indicate that it really doesn't matter how the war's ended as long as it is ended. And evidently that is a significant shift. It's also a substantial change in communications. We've had our moments here where we uttered a few critical statements about this, and obviously we could go into much more detail. But one underlying hypothesis, which has always been formulated, and one narrative which is currently being used all the time, is that Ukraine has no path to victory, that Ukraine is encircled, or its troops, that Ukraine is not winning, that they shouldn't have ticked off the bigger power.
Yeah, they're at fault for existing and having the cheek to resist in the first place, right? That seems to be the underlying assumption of the traders in the White House. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, and I have to say, there have been some bad signals for a long time. It is an utter misapprehension to think that Ukraine is losing this war. By President Zelensky's own math, Russian casualties exceed 1 million men since the start of the full-scale invasion. Just thus far in this year, we're not even at St. Patrick's Day, the Russians have lost 100,000 men. They are Pharaoh's army. They are bogged down in a war that is as unwinnable as Vietnam was for the United States. I've said this in a number of reportages recently, and I believe it's true. Russia is weaker now militarily than it ever was since Molotov-Ribbentrop in 1939. And no one can tell me differently. They've lost 1 million men. They've lost more than 20,000 main battle tanks. They've lost 40,000 armored vehicles, tens of thousands of artillery pieces. Look, that doesn't make you stronger. It makes you weaker. So am I talking out of my hat? They use golf carts to transmit people to the front. They're using donkeys. I'm not talking about Democrats. I'm talking about donkeys. That's not winning a war, right? Che Guevara uses donkeys, not a first, the premier army of the Second World. So we need to get that aside. Ukraine is not the fainting damsel in distress. However, pulling the plug on her intelligence feeds in the middle of a hot war definitely those were foul means. And it was the United States demonstrating that if you're going to fight blind, it's going to cost you.
What they're not looking at, Axel, is the strategic situation. Chuck talked about the military part of it, but the very fact that Kyiv is still free shows that Russia lost the strategic battle in the first 2 weeks. And also what the messages that the White House seems to be listening to are the Russian ones, where they conveniently say that Ukraine can't win because of its mobilization issues, etc. But the very fact is that they're not talking about their economic situation, their military situation, in the fact that they just have tanks now left from the 1960s in storage, which they're trying to rehabilitate. But as Chuck said, they're coming to the front in golf carts and motorcycles and civilian cars. That's no way to do maneuver warfare, right? So it's not the case that Ukraine is necessarily losing from a strategic perspective, even though Russia is gaining a little bit on the ground in Kursk and in the Donbass.
At the same time, of course, we have the situation that Ukrainian forces most recently actually made good amount of progress in counterattack. There were, and Chuck and I discussed this ahead of the first meeting President Zelensky took, which became, the White House fireside chat from in infamy, if you so like. Ahead of that, we talked about the fact that Ukraine should probably try to establish a couple of corridors and a couple of targets where they can show progress to defang the narrative, which National Security Advisor Waltz, as well as at that point in time, even General Kellogg, right after the Munich Security Conference, had already seeded and regularly spoken about and brought forward. And we spoke about Kreminna, we spoke about Kupiansk, we spoke about Krovsk, and funny enough, which names did we hear just recently, Chuck? What have the Ukrainians done?
Exactly. There is a problem, though, and that is, if were I a Ukrainian war planner, I, of course, am not, but were I even a bright young lieutenant commander on the general staff, I would hesitate before I planned or executed any offensive ground maneuver operations, because I cannot depend on Washington. And in fact, so far this year, I can count on Washington to do the worst possible thing at the worst possible. Unplug my intelligence. Now, there's another thing that the press isn't covering. Ukraine has been brought to the negotiation table, and to use General Kellogg's term, because it was hit in the face with a 2x4, his words, not mine. And thus far, from the Russians, we hear the same maximalist demands. We hear them saying they don't want a ceasefire till 2026. And as we're going on here right now, this is 1500 hours. I'm in the Eastern Daylight Time Zone. 18 Tu-95 bombers are being ramped up right now, and they are wheels up and they are going to attack Ukraine tonight. And I don't need to tell anyone who listens to us, the targets are civilians in Ukrainian cities. Russia is nowhere near engaged in this dialogue, negotiation, whatever it is, but Russia isn't.
Which brings us to the point, as Russia is, of course, not playing. This has been highlighted. Various representatives of Ukraine, as well as, of course, various ministers in Europe from those nations who are, shall we say, a little bit more in tune with what the Russians do have in mind, have stated exactly that over the past days, yet again. And, of course, directly after Mr. Witkoff had the pleasure of waiting for his overarching real estate transaction for 8 hours whilst Luka and Vladimir sat together mocking him for that matter. Now, when that was the case, people stated very clearly, I also could refer to Pekka Toveri, the former head of Finnish military intelligence, who highlighted that, of course, the Russians will utilize pretty much every opportunity to exploit whatever narrative can say, whatever happens at the border now with Kursk, they will exploit as a narrative. The fighting withdrawal, which, as you indicated, Chuck, has been precipitated or at least accelerated by the lack of battlefield intelligence, they will exploit now. And wow, has that happened? The encirclement, which is we should go with the British approach of the magic circle, the magic circle of the London law firms. Now we have a magic encirclement, the one which does not exist. And of course, they can all claim that this is the case, and that even if the Ukrainians now manage to actually do their fighting withdrawal from what they beforehand occupied in the Kursk Oblast properly, even then, in hindsight, everybody will say, oh, that was unclear. They managed to escape, and they only managed to escape and do the fighting withdrawal because we spoke to Putin. The insanity of this overlay of propaganda and the insidiousness of that approach is not lost upon anyone in Europe. But at the same time, it does not reflect at all what happens on the battlefield.
No, and I just was on Twitter this afternoon. I'm sorry, Scott, I'll just be very brief. There are two parallel universes here. There are Ukrainian soldiers fighting at the front right now as though nothing else is going on in the world, right? Russia has not diminished its offensive action. They have not slowed down. They have not modulated their attacks. And in fact, within hours, and I'm not kidding, folks, we'll have breaking news during this event, Russian cruise missiles are going to be slamming into Ukrainian cities, right? There is a delusion in Marco Rubio's head between this year and that year. That is that the Russians are going to, first of all, that they will engage in this process. They may eventually do so if their oil tankers are seized all over the world. I spoke with Alan Brewer the other night saying exactly that. We've got 10 operational SEAL teams. Every single shadow tanker could be seized and under U.S. control in about, I'm not going to tell you the number of hours, but you'd be very impressed. And there is nothing Russia could do about it. They don't have a blue water navy. Okay, that's what it's going to take to get Russia to the table. And that we're not even there yet to talk about, will Russia thereafter honor its treaty and guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty, peace, and security? Haven't we already been there with the Minsk agreements? Right? 20 iterations of the treaty, 200 meetings, not to mention Budapest. Come on. They're not a reliable interlocutor for any diplomatic effort. And how far, Scott, would you trust Mr. Lavrov with your car keys?
I would trust him not at one bit. I would not let him out of my sight, out of the restaurant, as it were. In the propaganda war, as you mentioned, multiple fronts in this combined war is the fact of how the Trump administration is reacting to Putin's claim that he likes the ceasefire in principle, but you have to get to the underlying things that will be productive of peace. Well, when President Zelensky mentioned security guarantees that were the very category of consideration that Putin is bringing up, he got yelled at the Oval Office. And the response to Putin is, oh, very encouraging signs out of Moscow. Now, how does that figure? How does that play at all?
Somebody called it mirroring. The tactic is mirroring. And he's trying to project something positive upon Putin, so Putin feels flattered, then he can mirror it, and therefore they then end up in a cycle of becoming convivial again, which of course nobody is really doing, because one thing which can be very quickly established is that the original aims of the Putin regime to destroy Ukraine, to dominate it, to find a way to dissect it, all of these aims have not yet been reached. Therefore, they will not give up.
Right.
No,
But what will the American administration do? Will they force Putin to legitimately to the table, or will they use it as an excuse to cause or to try to force Ukraine to capitulate? That's
well, you saw the interview. You saw the interview, I presume, at least the snippet of Mr. Sean Hannity, the great, shall we say, political thinker and philosopher, the Russia expert extraordinaire, the person who has been wielding weapons for and on behalf, and has blood on his shoes from combat, of course, Mr. Sean Hannity, who highlighted that he could, and with Mr. Walls on the other side, that he would imagine that areas with Russians in it would therefore be ceded, territorial concessions. We're back with this kind of talk. We're back to the same kind of occupation philosophy, the same kind of Russian narrative which has been used since 2014, which was employed to justify part of the so-called special military operation. We are back to the justification talk of those who have lapped up the Russian propaganda narratives in the Western world and in the United States for ages. And this comes up in an interview in 2025 between a conservative so-called media host and the National Security Advisor of the United States of America, no less. Chuck, how on earth?
That is a good question. How on earth? And we're talking today, Sunday afternoon. I want everyone to think about next Sunday afternoon. We may be doing this again. This experiment seems to be working. There is a lot that is going to have to happen to compel Russia into legitimate negotiations here. And I don't see Russia responding to anything else except their primary language, which I am afraid is violence. They will understand violence. Now, I take Mr. Putin at his word. If he signs a document, I don't take him at his word, but let's take him at his word what he says now. He's not interested in a ceasefire till 2026. Look, that's what he says, but I see his bullets are being delivered to the front line by donkeys and golf carts, right? I see that every time he launches a platoon or company-sized attack, he loses between 35 and 85% of the attacking force everywhere, every day, all over the zero line. And that runs in about 200, 250 points of contact every day. I watch this every day. I see it happen. I no longer see a Russian force capable of conducting large-scale combined arms maneuver operations to, for example, take Kyiv, to take Dnipro, to push themselves any farther west than they are now. Russia actually needs this ceasefire. And I would also say this, what are we wishing for? An interim in which Russia can do what? Axel, stop me when I go on the crazy train. Aren't they going to pump 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100,000 more troops into Ukraine if they don't have to worry about ATACMS and everything else?
They will. They will. They certainly will. I was just about to say hi. As we're testing this, Chuck, I can see that one of our audience has come up as a speaker on our X space, to which this YouTube a video is being piped. Let's try whether the technique actually works here. Freedom, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Wow. Yes,
loud
Freedom.
And clear.
That is wonderful.
We managed to bridge the deep divide between YouTube and Twitter. There you go. Freedom, good afternoon. Good evening.
Hi, thank you so much. Hi, Chuck.
Hey, Freedom.
Hi,
it's great to hear your voice.
So I just wanted to say I got some good news in this world of shit that we live in. My wife's sister, who lives in Kyiv, got a visa, a tourist visa, to visit us in the U.S.
Wonderful. Just wonderful. Congratulations, friend. I know that didn't magically happen. Thank you for all the hard work you did, I'm sure, to make that happen.
Well, it wasn't nearly as hard as the fiance visa I did 5 years ago, but thanks.
But there you go. No, very good news. As you highlighted, sometimes there are silver linings. This is definitely one of them. And thank you, by the way, for rejoining us. And given the fact that we've been talking here for on our Mriya Report space since, what's it now? 3 years. Jesus.
3 years, yeah. We're not getting any handsomer, I'll tell you that, folks.
All righty. Now, whilst we're waiting for Scott to also reappear, currently we're 2 men rowing this boat, but whilst we're waiting for Scott to reappear, Chuck, we've discussed this, but I think it's worthwhile having again. The fact that people do not take in information at this point in time is both by design, the way the administration has structured its intake of information, and by, shall we say, desire. It seems that the president seemingly, McMaster's highlighted this in his book, does not wish to read much, if anything. He likes to have a personal representation and report. He takes in certain bullet points, gets guidance from the individuals, and then assembles his view, respectively, makes decisions. If that is still the same, as H.R. McMaster described it in his book quite comprehensively, then, of course, key decisions as to who refines the information and presents the information have a significantly bigger weight. Now, if someone like Tulsi Gabbard is now there in a daily briefing alongside Mr. Walls, who is currently traveling more than he is, well, on site, and if the president often enough is in Mar-a-Lago and they have to do this through means of telecommunications, how do you think that that conveyance of critical information will work to provide the president with better information?
Fortunately, I have the whiff of courtierism in this, and that includes who shall give the sacrosanct daily presidential brief. Unfortunately, and I have seen this happen. And again, I was a worker bee in national security, right? I did not routinely go to the White House. However, who briefs and what they say, you will get into this feedback loop where the boss isn't told bad news. So no better example of that is Putin's daily brief. But here's what I want to tell everyone to watch. You're going to see, I predict, increasing frustration on the part of Washington. They're not going to get what they want next week out of Putin. And it may be the week after, so we may be looking at April, before the White House realizes that they're not going to move the Russian needle. unless things like ATACMS do it, long Neptunes. The Crimea bridge is going to have to come down. Now, I'm going out on a limb here, but it doesn't take much of a crystal ball. Tell me that, look, Russia, this isn't a real estate deal. Russia doesn't have a property to unload. They're not willing to buy or sell. And I hope that there are people in the national security apparatus who still remember what the Cold War was like. The Russians would say up is down, black is white, night is day. You could almost predicate your assessments on exactly what they didn't say. Just go 180 degrees out of it. We didn't shoot down that airliner. It was actually a U.S. reconnaissance plane. People have forgotten this. We don't have the Soviet Union anymore, but we have Russia, which was the soul and the beating black heart of the police state of all police states. So I just want everyone to watch. We're going to see, and I'm not sure you're going to see frustration out of the talking heads, out of Rubio, out of whoever else is fronting this operation. You are going to see Russian intransigence. It is going to continue. They have got to be held into these. I'm not going to call it a negotiation, a dialogue. And I frankly, Axel, I don't have any hope of this negotiation system. I remember when the Vietnam War was ending and there was a 6-month discussion in Paris about the shape of the table. You remember that? Okay, it's just a historical nugget. I thought I'd throw it out there.
Away the funding for the South Vietnamese, which is why they lost that war. But there you go. Having said this, unfortunately, currently the polarization in US politics has led us to a point that the pendulum is swinging into one extreme direction, which brings us people who have been equally demoralized beforehand during the years when they were not in power, as the others are now demoralized. And I will quote Bezmenov in this regard, because I think it's perfect for that. Bezmenov said in his interview, this is what, 1984? 1984. A person who is demoralized is unable to assess true information. Facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him a concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he receives a kick in his fan bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That is the tragedy of the situation of demoralization. Why does it matter? It seems that the internecine fighting for narrative dominance and political leadership in the US has accelerated this process of demoralization, which Bezmenov stipulated the Soviet Union had instigated and contributed to in the late 1960s, throughout the 1970s and early 80s. And unfortunately, that demoralization leaves people then pre-programmed to be significantly more passive, less receptive to real information. And then, unfortunately, no matter how active they are later, they will act within the framework rather than be able to assess the framework itself. Now, this brings us to Mr. Witkoff, it brings us to Mr. Trump, it brings us to those people who believe that they can negotiate anything. And when you criticize them, they say, but no, listen, Reagan negotiated with Gorbachev. Well, no, he confronted Gorbachev. He didn't negotiate, he confronted him. He stipulated, he negotiated by fact. This is a completely different thing. The first test of SDI was brought forward on the evening of the meeting with Gorbachev in Geneva. A better, clear statement of action, and in this case, having an impact on this negotiation, on the perception of the Soviet Union that SDI could be negotiated about, was off the table, and whether it be functional. And yes, people say that, oh, not everything in the system was functional. Completely irrelevant. It drew the Soviet Union to the point that they had to invest so much, which they couldn't afford, that they went bankrupt.
Precisely. The end of the Cold War was SDI and economics. But there is one means of power projection that Russia maintained, and that is their ability to inflect information, as you were talking about. They have done that to such a point where there are some Americans, and some of them are very highly placed indeed, who will tell you that, look, it is just fine that Russia needs to dictate the internal political structure of Ukraine. That's okay. It's okay that Russia take over the industries and natural resources of Ukraine because it has traditionally been in their sphere of dominance. And that's okay. This isn't our problem. So many people start from that. They start from that. They don't know that this has been a process ongoing since the 1930s, when the Soviet Union committed genocide against the Ukrainian people in a politically engineered famine that killed at least 5 million Ukrainians, and possibly 10. And if you haven't read Annie Applebaum's book, please do. It's an easy read. You'll get it for the weekend, but you'll put it down and you're going to want to take a shower.
I like it when you said it's an easy read, because it's many things.
Well, it's not. It's many things, but it's not an easy read. Actually, it's gut churning. But
Yeah.
that hatred for Ukraine has never gone away. And even during the times of the Soviet Union, the Russians had to put their hands in their pockets and realize Ukraine built all their ships, built all their aircraft. It built their rocketry and space capsules. They were the brains of the Soviet Union. And even the vaunted Moskva, carrier killer and flagship of the Black Sea, was laid down in Mykolaiv. And that's right, folks, in Ukraine.
And
So,
what was its name? Slava.
Slava, glory. That was her name. Absolutely, glory. And she was taken very seriously as a warship. Believe me, I was a naval officer in those days. She was not something to be trifled with. And anytime she went anywhere, I guess I can say it now, she had a consort with her, which was generally a Los Angeles class attack submarine. So, to our Russian listening guest. But we need to clear the air about this. Russia does not have the right to dictate internal politics to Ukraine. It does not have the right to poison Ukraine's presidential candidates. It doesn't have the right to shoot snipers into Maidan Square. It doesn't have the right. Ukraine has turned its face to the West. And unfortunately, the beacon of the West has turned that light out right.
But in there, the interesting thing, it comes back to this to this migration of narratives, and to the fact that people have now assumed this. We see this great inversion, because, and let me just quote this: President Trump sits together with Volodymyr Zelensky, and then Trump goes on, "You see the hatred he's got for Putin. It's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate. He's got tremendous hatred, and I understand that. But I can tell you, the other side isn't exactly in love with him either." It's inverted. Taking the result of the Ukrainians who have been genocided against, who have suffered Russian imperialism and suppression, that the Ukrainian reaction is as calm and focused in their response to the Russian invasion. They know that only focus, only complete, relentless focus and hard fighting will get them out of there. It's not hatred necessarily even, but the fact that Trump needs to project that supposedly it's Zelensky's fault to have animosity, at least, but ultimately from his perspective, of course, hatred, because that's what you do if you're a media personality. It's not them, because the other side isn't exactly in love with him either. You should invert it. You should say there's a lot of hatred in the Russian imperialism and denial of the right of Ukrainians as such to exist. Don't forget, they are the ones who call them essentially little Russians. For them, they are a second or third class of humans. They are serfs. They're projectionists, that they are not worth having their own sovereign state. They're a figment of imagination. This is the projection. And Trump accepts this by literally sugarcoating it by saying, isn't exactly in love with him either. You cannot try to assume a position of so-called neutrality, which he says he is now, because he's just a mediator, which is, again, the wrong approach. You don't mediate and broker between good and evil. You confront evil. And this brings me back to, it's not the same what Mr. Trump does and what Reagan and his administrations did. It's not the same what Ike and Kennedy and Nixon did. You could say that LBJ was a bit, discombobulated when giving interviews on the bog and making statements about the Russians. And you could say that the Americans lost a bit of traction in those years. But one thing is certainly true. None of these presidents would have said that it's the fault of the Poles, the Romanians, the Moldovans, Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians who have come under the thumb of the Russians. On the contrary, they would have very clearly highlighted who's who in the zoo. And by accepting, however, these pre-programmed narratives of the Russians, we are following, respectively, the Americans are currently following, not we in Europe, but the Americans are following a pre-programmed system which which narrows down the outcomes, because there is no negotiation. This is trying to to mold Ukraine into a form which coincides more with what is then a somewhat acceptable outcome of the maximalist approach of Russian demands on the one hand, and what Mr. Trump believes he can sell to the American public. And we need to literally, it's like, if somebody is in the wrong lane, you have to kick him out of the lane in some shape or form. And I can only hope that the Europeans, now that Germany seemingly is on track, there's a couple of things to be voted upon next week, but if you now have France, Britain, Germany, hopefully plus Italy, leading the conversation in Europe, we might be better off, because there is no other way that Ukraine can be supported sufficiently, conventionally, other than by Europe actually, rolling up its sleeves and doing its job. And somebody has to also speak up for them. Macron doesn't do that. Don't forget, Macron speaks to the Ukrainians. He speaks about Putin. He sometimes speaks with Mr. Trump, but he does not confront the president on anything. Not a single one. Keir Starmer definitely doesn't confront him. There's not a single person who confronts President Trump currently in an acceptable fashion, because they all fear that they are not strong enough, or that they don't have the capability, which is not quite true. And it shouldn't be. I mean, Ms. von der Leyen doesn't have an army, she doesn't have a mandate, and it's a heterogeneous setup in the EU. So it's not a United States of Europe. We don't have that, and it won't happen anyway. But the key thing is that there is sufficient economic strength, sufficient logistical capacity. There's many things which are delayed, which are not there, and we've discussed it here many times. What is missing? But one thing is definitely there: the capability.
State. There are various levels of commitment training. As you know well, training in economics, and you have great grasp and understanding of not just European politics.
Flattery will get you nowhere.
Well, it's true, because I stay in my own lane here, but it's a bit aspirational, I think, at this point, me to Europe stepping in and assuming that load. You know, putting aside the great arsenal of democracy, which I grew up with, now the guy in charge of that toy box is so completely unviable. I have no idea what he's. I do categorically believe this thing. Well, Russia is not in a position to military solution. And they're not going to summer offensive. Tips the balance of this. They didn't do it ago, 2 years ago.
On the contrary, the Ukrainians are the ones who have trained and trained and trained. The question is now whether they have sufficient amount of supplies to then pick and choose the attack vectors along the line of contact.
Nice. Put some points on the board. I agree. Our move, absolutely. But I'm serious, and I served on joint staffs. I'd be the guy writing the memo saying, General, I can't endorse this plan. We have to have rock solid logistical commitment from our allies, coalition partners, that in the middle of a drive towards, a crossing of the Dnipro River south of Kherson, that all of a sudden everything gets turned off again, as it did in Kursk. I want everyone to sit that in. Those Ukrainian commanders were getting vital intelligence every day, signals intelligence, overhead imagery, electronic warfare intelligence, all of the multifarious information that is necessary to command a battle space, and suddenly that was all turned off. Nobody saw that coming. Nobody. I don't know who thought of that evil deed, but it made so Ukraine's in the 5th round of a 12-round fight, and all of a sudden they get a blindfold put on them. They get punished for a round, and then they are compelled to come to signal that they're ready to negotiate the rest of the bout. Totally unfair, absolutely unfair, but sends a chilling message to NATO and especially to Ukraine, that if Uncle Sam can do that, wow, they can do anything. And we're dealing with a commander-in-chief. I like to stay off politics here. I can talk about the functioning of a commander-in-chief. We've got a commander-in-chief who is very capricious. And Axel, you and I were serving in NATO at about the same time. I know that I never saw anything like this in all of service, and I'm sure you didn't either.
Take Bush the elder. Okay, politician, went to the CIA, became the commander-in-chief at a time which was critical in the transition from the Soviet Union onwards, then had to literally engage for the first time since the Second World War a coalition, a large coalition going into war, because Vietnam you can't say is a coalition. You could argue about Korea, yes, but okay, fine. So the first time since Korea in a coalition warfare, in order to bring Saddam Hussein back into Iraq out of Kuwait, Bush the elder would never have been considered to be capricious. Many issues to criticize, and I know that people will wander off into Chicken Kiev territory and whatnot, but the man himself was a reasonably adept president in that regard, because he did understand the primary foundations of U.S. foreign policy transcend one presidency. Which brings me to the other area of, because we were not talking about politics per se, because it's relevant in this case, because this is an administration which is now on hand, which has been given by Congress the mandate to govern with the personnel it has sought out to govern with, and say have an executive functions. But if you look at the lack of experience which is vested in certain people at this point in time, and I'm not decrying Mr. Ratcliffe, I'd rather focus on Mr. Hegseth and the Gabbard of all Gabbards, there is a lack of qualification, and there is a lack of capability, and there is a lack of duty of care for the job, whilst at the same time both deny these, shall we say, foundational values of either having an alliance, respectively defending the rights of free people. It seems to me that we will have to deal with these people until the person who you just refer to, the commander-in-chief, may actually feel so frustrated by their, shall we say, lack of competency that he replaces them. But this makes this a very capricious apprentice show, yeah, bit risky, isn't it?
It is, Scott. I see you're back, Scott, and what we're talking about the capriciousness of the commander-in-chief and its effect on Ukraine's ability to defend itself. Let's not anyone think affects Ukraine's ability to wage war on the Russians, because that is not what's happening here.
Except for the inconvenience of having the targeting intelligence taken away that the missiles that the U.S. supply run on, which doesn't help on the battlefield.
No, and there's you know, I'm very serious about this, and I'd like people to watch this carefully. Watch the messaging from Washington and watch over the next 5 days. I don't expect Russia to make any approachment at all. They're going to stick to the maximalist demands. They are going to continue to say they're not interested in any sort of military pause until 2026. And if I could do a little pop psychology, I think that the commander-in-chief of the United States is going to become increasingly frustrated. I don't think he is very likely to reconsider his own courses of action, but I do think he will probably start firing people. We saw him, and unfortunately, sideline General Kellogg. I wrote an op-ed for the Kyiv Post this week. I considered him the adult leadership on the American side. This is a man, look, you don't get to be a lieutenant general by being a dummy. And the U.S. Army throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, it is oriented in Europe. He has a fine grasp of military operations, both overt and covert, white and gray zone operations, and what Russia is capable of. He is the guy who should have been saying to the president, look, listen to what they're saying and watch what they're doing, right? There is a missile attack that is going to happen imminently on Ukrainian cities tonight. This does not bode well for whatever the commander-in-chief thinks is going to happen next week. So let's watch next week. Let's look at the messaging from Washington. Let's watch what Russia does. And I think the frustration level in the President POTUS, we're going to see some big moves. I think not this week, next week.
Well, that is the key. I mean, that's what I brought up in the article that has been submitted to the Kyiv Post that I tentatively titled Geopolitical Jiu-Jitsu. We hope that Putin will frustrate the U.S. administration, and hopes for that. Kyiv hopes for that. They're playing the game well. right? They said, okay, unconditional ceasefire, we're in. They had proposed air and sea, and the Trump team said, no, we want across all battlefronts. So they ceded to that. Now Putin puts on conditions that Washington signals are, encouraging, which is very frustrating, right? Wrong messaging, since they're actually completely unacceptable as long initiatives for Ukraine. But Ukraine's playing along. We hope that that exactly as you say, Trump gets frustrated with Putin. He may even fire members of his team for being useful idiots or for being obstructionists or whatever. And at the same time, he may come back and try to impose those conditions on Kyiv. So at the same time, Ukraine has to be, as they are, working diligently with the Europeans to have a backstop in case they have to say, no, we don't accept the ceasefire with these terms. Right. So it's tough. They're walking two different tightropes at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but this is still all within the wrong framework. And Ukraine was
what is the right framework?
We were in the framework of Trump administration wants to force a ceasefire as say a first step to an immediate or very quick peace deal as quickly as possible, because they don't want this war. Trump constantly repeats himself that the waste has to end, the waste of lives, the waste of money. This has to end, and that is the framework. It's a framework and the basis for discussion, which we've seen in the past from other people whose appeasement was born out of the need to stop war as such. His is there's a waste of life and money. And he specifies this in recent days. So, because therefore opportunities are wasted. It's part of a larger pivot. And Mr. Waltz has highlighted this even, and Rubio conceded this, that they're trying to peel off Russia from China. That inadvertently all follows the same and completely, utterly wrong theory, which has been around for ages, seemingly, and seemingly has impressed these people who have, as H.R. McMaster said, a rather simplistic view of history and geopolitics. They are following the heartland theory still today. We are still looking at people who think that Mackinder matters. They separate the world today into China, the US, and Russia because of nuclear weapons and because of size. These people look at the size of a map, and from that and that alone, they decide how to, say, opine, as opposed to economics, as opposed to usage of resources, capabilities, culture, long-standing historical facts, the overall development of climate factors. And I'm not talking climate change. I'm saying just the impact of climate factors on how cultures develop and what happens and what people do with it and how they survive over time. They completely, utterly fail in the category of even, shall we say, college education of geopolitics. It is such a simplification and such an abysmal failure to deal with nuance and with complexity in an appropriate fashion. And you can only communicate properly, straightforward, simple concepts to people if you have thought about them properly. You could see this with Ronald Reagan. Take the speech he held at the Goldwater Convention. Take that speech as a basis for his own thinking, where freedom starts, how you protect freedom, and how, in protecting freedom, you actually fight for it and with allies in order to protect that freedom. What the individual does vis-a-vis the government, how we should stand up to government, what government should and should not do. He encapsulates this in one speech because he has thought about it. And therefore, he can refine it into clear-cut language. Reel this back, take the current administration, ask Mr. Hegseth whether he could do so. Try to find a way to discuss this with Ms. Gabbard. I've taken the liberty of reviewing a couple of her interviews, and especially the long-form interviews she gave over time when she was still a Democrat, when she was still actually trying to hide from her collaboration with the Russians in Syria, and with her terrible, terrible presence there with Mr. Assad, where she didn't tell Congress that her boondoggle was actually designated to be meetings with Assad, and that they only came up by happenstance. It was an opportunity. No, she was picked up directly at the airport by Assad, but it doesn't matter. You have to listen to these people and see that they are just not qualified. It's just like entrusting the leadership of Britain to Liz Truss. Same thing. Or to Keir Starmer, for that matter. I'm sorry to say that. So we are dealing
But
currently
Axel,
with people.
I totally
we're
agree.
dealing with people who can't deal with complexity. That's the point.
Right. But what does
and
Ukraine
it's
do?
even to sort of adjust this
no,
to
I
the
totally
meanest
agree
level of
with your point.
understanding.
And that
It isn't a bipolar
Go ahead, Chuck. I can't.
structure. It isn't the Cold War, U.S. versus USSR, China on the side. It's not a tripolar event now that China has developed itself militarily. They're missing the entire. If you're trying to play that three-dimensional chess, you're missing what this really is and how the Ukraine war started. So 2014, when the little green men start showing up and General Gerasimov astounds the military world with a piece of original thinking. Nobody thought he could come up with this, but it was hybrid warfare. It said the same things: deniable military operations, gray zone operations economically, politically, culturally, in the information space. And there for a while, General Gerasimov, who is not one of my favorite generals, but he was the darling of military intellectuals all over the world because they watched him pull this off in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Kherson, and then laying the groundwork for a misapprehension that still lives and breathes in people's heads. Ukraine was Nazi, and we had to invade them because they were raping and killing and murdering Russian speakers. There have been Russian speakers in Ukraine for about 1,000 years, right? Nearly every person in Ukraine is multilingual, and with the intelligent classes all having had Russian shoved down their throat so they could advance in education, in employment, etc. But that still resonates with people. You have otherwise educated people saying, well, Russia had to do something about those Nazis, didn't they? That's why they had to take Crimea, and that's why they had to. It's insanity. And then there's another misapprehension. Well, we can only provoke the Russians so far. Okay, let's just forget. I'm not even going down the nuclear rabbit hole. Everyone knows what I think about that. 95% of Russia's military force is engaged right now in Ukraine. They can't win. They're not going to win. Are you afraid they're going to escalate? What? Stealing washing machines out of people's wrecked apartments? They can't win this war. Let's make sure that they get to an object lesson in that for the next year. They're losing 400,000 people a year. Let's make sure they lose 800,000 in 2025, because unfortunately, that's what it takes to win a war. And remember, this war was one man's idea. It was Vladimir Putin's idea. And the buck stops with him.
All righty. Chuck, in the meantime, I just have to highlight this. Thomas reminded me of the fact we are currently, this today is our first 3 Men in a Boat live on YouTube on the Information Warfare Initiative channel, which some of you will know already. We've normally done this in various formations and recorded it, but today it's not only live on YouTube, but we also are live on Twitter or on X. So people who are following us through the Mriya Report channel, you can ask us questions there as well. And you can just ask for the microphone if you so like, and then can interact with us. We'll be here for a little while longer. At the same time, I can see that we even have some comments on YouTube, and I'm told that there's a Mr. John Cromwell. I presume he is not going to storm Parliament, but he's asking, what is the argument for not using those frozen assets so Ukraine can finish the job? Right. Okay. Well, that's a technical thing, but let's highlight this. There's a couple of precedents which the Europeans who currently hold most of those assets in at Euroclear and Belgium, respectively, at the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, as well as in certain accounts in London, that the Europeans do not necessarily wish to set a precedent. They need to circumnavigate that challenge. That is doable. There's a number of sensible legal concepts to use for that. But it takes political will. And I think people have been waiting for Mr. Scholz to finally sign off from his chancellorship. And you will probably see a lot more movement as soon as Germany has a new chancellor in the next few weeks. The reasoning has to do with the fact that the Europeans seemed to fear that their capital markets might be impacted by a lack of full faith and credit in the stability and the preservation of property rights assigned with funds handed over to trustees. But then again, that will change, but it needs a certain declaration from the EU member states, which is forthcoming. It needs clear declarations from the states in which those entities and agencies are at home, be it the European Central Bank, the German Bundesbank, respectively, the British Treasury, and of course Euroclear. When those are made, you should expect that in May, June this year, a larger part of those frozen assets than before will be made available to back the European initiatives. There you go. But carry on. Scott, we interrupted you earlier. I apologize.
Oh, no, I was just asking the question, regardless of whether the frame is right or wrong, it comes with American power and threats behind it. So I agree that it's lacking nuance, of course, but it seems like Europe wants Ukraine to get on side with the Americans, wear a suit, Trump, whatever it takes, sign the agreement, sign the mineral deal. Whatever they're asking, go along with it. So the question to me is, if they don't play even-handed with Russia and force Russia to sign a sort of stripped-down ceasefire agreement and accede to some of Putin's crazy demands, then Ukraine won't be able to sign the ceasefire deal, right? We hope that they don't, or I hope that they don't. But that it doesn't totally require that Europe be on board behind them. But if Europe's not on board with additional weapons deliveries, political cover, willing to take on the Americans with the Ukrainians, then it may, they don't have to put down their arms, but it may turn into a guerrilla war, a resistance war instead of a conventional war. Unfortunately, right? Because that would mean more territory under Russian control. probably.
Yeah,
So
but see,
they're
this
playing
again,
along.
you're extrapolating from what is a precast module. There won't be, and fortunately, both Yermak as well as Zelensky have said this already. The Ukrainian parliament and the Ukraine, in its current composition, and it doesn't matter whether there would be new elections after, say, a peace treaty, and there won't be any beforehand, but the Ukrainian parliament, in its current constituted setup, will not allow for any territorial concessions. The European Union has allowed Ukraine to file its membership action plan, if you like, the acquis communautaire, has processed it. We are already in the process of admitting Ukraine, and now it comes. Ukraine in its full sovereign territory to the EU. That process is irreversible already. That process has led to the point that Ukrainians are already currently in Brussels working on the 5-year budget, which goes across 2030. So we are, and if you wish to say extrapolate, you should probably do it this way. We are in a position that Ukraine, if it can continue fighting, if it can protect its citizens, and has the support by European nations for that matter, and can find a balance with the Americans to the extent that the Americans will not further discombobulate Ukrainians' defense capability, then Russia starts running out of money. At the same point in time, whilst Ukraine proper is fully admitted member of the EU, and European nations, we have this little, mentioned paragraph that we are there to defend the sovereignty of all of our members. Russia hates nothing more than not having a peace deal with territorial concessions before Ukraine joins the EU. When Ukraine joins the EU, it joins in its borders. That's the whole thing. This is where they need to get to. And if they get there in time, that means that Russia will not be able to force them to sign off their territory. You could say, in classic Trump fashion, oh, it doesn't matter, we'll just do a deal. There won't be anyone in Ukraine willing to sign that deal, and they won't have to when they're members of it. Because we have more money. We have more industrial capacity.
That's assuming one of.
Sorry, please.
I can't hear Scott, actually.
That's
Scott.
assuming one of my conditions actually comes through, which is that Europe does support Ukraine substantially and sufficiently for them to force Russia to concede or to stop fighting or whatever, which is great. That's exactly what I want to have happen. What you said probably will happen. I hope you're right.
But
if that happens, then we're in good shape.
Well, I think recent events in continental Europe have shown that the French, who currently have nuclear capabilities, which others lack, the French have woken up to this, and Mr. Macron needs a topic. Don't forget, Macron needs a topic to be relevant
for his elections.
Well, it's not him, but it's he needs to stabilize the government. So that's fine. He won't have another term as a president. He can't. But in order to be able to make sure that he can prevent the, say, wolf in a sheepskin Le Pen clan from assuming power, and there is a very, very clear neo-fascist Russian appeasement undertone in the Rassemblée Nationale still today, even after they tried they try to get rid of many, many people. Fair enough. But they haven't gotten rid of the ill-fated ideology underneath it. So in order to, say, set the stage and do the right kind of politics, Macron has to have a topic. This is a topic in which he can engage. He has assets which are not interlinked with the Americans as much. So he can project a bit of Gaullism and therefore rejuvenate his own movement, which has been shrinking ideologically and in terms of acceptance in France, but re-injecting some Gaullism, which means anti-Americanism, into it. At the same time, he is still cozying up and cuddling up to Trump, using, I don't know, shall we say, the golden... he uses the French... Sorry, we have someone who's speaking. Please.
Tell Scott's co-host that I believe that Macron, c'est en utiliser le charme gallique. He's deploying a certain other type of Gallic charm in order to massage Trump somewhat, to assuage him. And he's also projecting this wonderful neo-Gaullism, which is to kind of stand apart from what's perceived as, unipolar places, and also distinct and apart from American might. As an American, I'm very happy and pleased with Macron. We call him Daddy Macron.
You said the right thing. Lee, you said the right thing. I was about to come to you in a second, but that's why we have the system with the hands up and the likes. I did see your hand. Neo-Gaullism, yes, that is the escape hatch for the reform movement, which Mr. Macron could not lead to success quite yet, but where he needs to actually project power internally in France at this point in time, and he is on that path. The problem is that French nuclear power and French nuclear weapons have a significantly higher per missile potency than the whole kaleidoscope of what American forces can project with. So therefore, you cannot stretch their capability. It's so to say, it's a one-event punch. You cannot stretch their capability and distribute the nuclear power, their nuclear missile capability as much. You would also have to have significantly more produced, and you would need to have the Rafale stationed all across Europe in order to be able to deliver it. So the delivery mechanism is not a nuclear triad supplemented by tactical nuclear weapons, supplemented by nuclear warheads, say, available, for example, in Germany to the German Air Force, because the Tornado, for example, in Germany would be a delivery mechanism for this. It's a completely different concept of deterrence and nuclear deterrence. So whilst neo-Gaullism sounds nice and it fits into the anti-Americanism, which is still latent in Europe, it doesn't really help against Russia. Well, what helps against Russia is force. But Chuck, please.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to add that the force de frappe, the French nuclear program, but based primarily, primary means of force projection are submarine-launched ballistic missiles. To me, instead of considering France to be the junior partner in nuclear NATO, I think it's good to remind our listeners, look, it is not just Russia versus the USA. There are two other nuclear armed powers, Great Britain and France. I look at the French nuclear capability as one of the principal reasons why I am constantly poo-pooing Putin's nuclear threats. First of all, Putin makes a nuclear threat against Ukraine. Ukraine has no strategic targets, right? What are you going to hit? Right? Well, you could say, well, I'm going to incinerate 3 million people in Kyiv. Great. Here's why that will never happen. He launches a ballistic missile from Siberia. It's streaking towards Ukraine. Paris has 6 minutes to figure out if that missile is going to land in France. That gives Putin pause. This is why his nuclear threats are preposterous. And in my estimation, and I worked a lot in counterproliferation and some nuclear targeting work as an officer. It is that dynamic. It is the French unknown and their manifest capability that Axel just mentioned. Missile per missile, they deliver more megatonnage than a more articulate nuclear force posture that the United States may have, making it just as lethal, more lethal actually, and much closer to the action. So, but I am delighted to see France flex its muscle. I want to see all of Europe do that. And especially now, because there's a bit of a leadership vacuum on the side of the Atlantic that I'm on right now. Troubling vacuum, I might say.
Alrighty, I see that Lee has a hand up. Lee, you had a follow-up question.
Yes, Axel. My follow-up question for Scott was, and first of all, I wanted to give just a very quick bit of context, is that I do spend a lot of time with the Vasco V4 translator, listening to Russian Telegram channels and trying to get a handle for what, the military wives and what the chatter is. And what I remember from 2 weeks ago, just shortly after the disastrous meeting when President Zelensky was ambushed, so, virtually humiliated in the Oval, I started to hear a lot of chatter that this would be very, very a quick jaunt before they get to go on rotation and then come home. We're hearing from general staff things like, well, they're just going to take Zaporizhia. They're just going to take, a few strategic towns to be able to, perhaps have staging grounds for later. And they were very confident. There was chatter, Axel, that they were no longer going to use conscripts from prisons, from the Vladimirov prison.
Yeah, but this is low. That's all. I understand this, but this is all low-level chatter on Telegram. Part of which is organized, by the way, for conveyance as having heightened credibility. I'm just highlighting. There's a whole farm set up for that matter in order to convey so-called amateur Telegram messages so that you can project more noise. But apart from that, one thing is true, and Chuck highlighted this earlier, I think, that there is a little bit of a jump in the step. There's a bit more juice in the Russian psyche when we appease them and when measures are taken as the administration has taken. But there you go. Carry on. Your question was?
Oh, no. Well, yes, it's this whole concept of what they call dukovnost, kind of this collective feeling that gives them the idea that they need to finish this and do this. But they themselves are, very keen on eliminating, and when I mean eliminating is by shooting what they consider inferior prison conscripts. And so after the Oval Office meeting, I started to notice whether it was organized chatter from organized Telegram information farms to amplify the Russian message, or from actual Russian wives, the wives that are talking among themselves and to their sisters-in-laws and whatnot, and venting. They started to say things like, well, this is just bullshit. This is awful. Our boys were supposed to be coming home. They were coming on rotation. What is the general staff saying now? And then, it's kind of a interesting nexus around that, a development around that, is that they began to have chatter about Patrushev, about eventually, well, Papa Patrushev will take care of this. What is happening? Why is it that the Hochholds are not being able to come to heal? And I believe that a lot of this just has to do with their feeling that their general staff has been telling them that this will end soon. They're no longer going to have to work with dirty prisoner conscripts, and they can go home on an extended vacation. And this is not happening. The golden handshake is not panning out. And so I completely agree 100% with everything that Scott is characterizing about how 90% of the Russian military is invested right now in the Ukraine theater. They can't defeat Ukraine militarily, or else they wouldn't be trying to come to heal. I wonder, my second question for you is, what can we do as supporters of Ukraine in the US from our side here? What can we do if we're multilingual and are able to speak in even the most superficial and most veneer thin of ways to strategic partners like Turkey, to their populace, in as much as it can influence people there, to what I believe that Erdogan is very wily, and he has, besides supplying Ukraine with the Bayraktar drones, I think he can play one of the most strategic roles in being a strategic partner to rebuild Ukraine. And I wanted to ask you, what do we do? What do we do on our side, on the propaganda side, on the NATO side from the US to encourage strategic partners, people in Tuva, whether it's Dagestan or just disgruntled Russians, disgruntled, areas of weakness, even if it's just along the Belarus border and people that are tired of this and the Russian menace. What can we do to effectuate more cooperation and to convince people here in the US that we speak to, and also strategic partners like Turkey and Macedonia or perhaps Montenegro, what they can do, what skin they have in the game to kind of bring about a Euromaidan? Is that possible, Axel?
No.
Well,
It has
I
been tried,
disagree a
but
little
no.
bit.
No, so,
Well-
so you want an answer. You made it a yes or no question, so I can give you a no. I can argue why, and we can dissect it, we can go through it. But, for example, Macedonia has completely different issues at this point in time than this. There's nothing which bears any resemblance to having an issue with, other than economic. Is the country undermined? Yes, it's being undermined. Serbia has a different issue. Will the Serb population, which has taken in 1.3 million Russians since this war began in one or the other form, will the Serb population, which has been pro-imperialism, okay, in different ways, left or right, doesn't matter there, pro-imperialism for ages, and it's exerted its own imperialist attitudes yet again in the wars in the 1990s. Will Serbia be of relevance? No. Belarusia is massively subjugated by Lukashenko. There's very little to reach. The people in Dagestan have completely different cultural issues, but they have significant suppression by the Russians. It's very hard to reach. Tuva, I don't think that anybody other than eating their terrible cakes and producing weapons that matter for that matter in this regard. I'm sorry, no, it's really, compared to what you get from Franconia, their stuff is just too full of sugar. But you know this. Anyway, I don't think that we can reach the Russians. It's like in Germany, there was once a famous, poet and how do you go? He was a satirist. He wrote very satirical texts for many, many moons. And he once wrote a notion, mit Nazis reden, speaking with Nazis. Is it necessary? Was his question. And then he made a case as to, no, it's not necessary. The same thing here. Whilst, for example, in the Second World War, the Americans projected and the Brits projected with their own counter-propaganda into the German radio space messages, they knew fairly well that there was a complete overlay of German propaganda. The only thing they could do was project news and make sure that the news were as reliable and consistent as possible, because they knew that certain parts of the German population in northern Germany were generally over hundreds of years more predisposed to interacting with Britain, would be able to listen to this and take in the news. They knew that they had very little they could impact central Germany or, say, southern Germany, Bavaria, Austria, for that matter. There was no way to reach the population by this means. So as a consequence, the same thing applies here. Reaching deep into Russia, very little impact. You're not going to motivate anybody in Magnitogorsk to not go to do the ironworks in order to produce tanks, steel for tanks and armored plates. No, you won't be able to get anyone in Nizhny Tagil not to go to the iron hearse. No, it won't happen. There is no way in what is today a technology-enhanced, oligarchically run dictatorship which controls you everywhere. There's no way that someone who is a dissident has not already left or has just receded into a shell in Russia. The remainder of managed opposition is what we see currently in the West, constantly being brandished about and bandied about. And don't forget that people still talk to Ms. Navalny, which they shouldn't. But there you go. There is no way that you can reach them. The only thing you can do is defeat them. When they are defeated in battle, then they have to actually confront those who made the decisions as to why Russia were to be defeated in battle. When that happens, things change. This is how, by the way, the seeds of the Russian Revolution are not just set by the German Oberkommando des Heeres and sending Mr. Lenin through on the train, unfortunate as this will have been, and it probably was one of the worst moves ever. No, the seeds of the Russian Revolution, both Kerensky as well as in the Bolsheviks, were set in Brest-Litovsk and the 1.5 years in the run-up to it. They need to be defeated, then things change. You cannot change the war by appealing to Russian opposition. That won't happen. So that's my argument for the no, but I hand it to Chuck and to Scott.
Wow. No, thank you. I am going to listen to the advice of the Franconian satirist that you mentioned. If you can put in the link what his name was, that there is no reason, no practical reason to meet Lada Nazi. No reason to talk with them.
Don't speak with the Nazis. Don't.
The overlay.
Yeah.
Lee,
Say that again?
Wiglaf, his name was Wiglaf Droste. He unfortunately died too early. Wiglaf, Wiglaf Droste, Droste.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you so much. And I want to thank you and Scott for hosting this space. It's extremely informative. It's concise. And you're really, really able to speak to a broad, more comprehensive, or very, very technically geopolitical comprehensive way that is sometimes that we aren't able in NAFO spaces to absorb. So I'm very, very grateful that you have done this, and congratulations. And thank you to the Uranagatory Twitter Spaces recording. Danke. Slava Ukraini.
And Lee, I would give you one
Your
more.
own Slava.
I would slightly.
Thanks, Lee.
I would slightly change your target set. I agree with Axel that there isn't a whole lot we can do to fight this sort of, pass out newspapers in the Death Star. But what you can do is influence the information microcosm that you're in. You speak to the intelligent people you know who may or may not hold views akin to our own, and I believe that they simply lack the information. There's some otherwise very well-informed people who still, as we mentioned earlier, cling to this idea that Russia was compelled to save Ukrainian citizens from a Nazi regime. Just bringing.
What else would we like to cover, Axel?
I don't know, Scott. It seems that you didn't hear Chuck.
Oh no, it's I couldn't.
I don't hear or see Chuck. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was having trouble with.
Okay.
Somehow Scott and I were not linking, but I'll wind that up pretty quickly. You can talk to those people that you can reach, because they're the very circumstances of this war are called into question, right? Look, Ukraine did nothing to provoke this. There was no casus belli, right? This is an invasion by an imperially motivated power and it, as Trump likes to say, look, and it's about resources. It's about industry. It is about an expansionist power leaning on a weakened neighbor. And I am one of these guys. I hate to bring up even this word domino, but again, it comes into play. If Ukraine falls, Latvia, Lithuania, and I love the domino theory, because I remember when people laughed and scoffed and said, "Oh, it's ridiculous." The domino theory was that if the North invades the South and takes it, that Laos and Cambodia would fall. But that is precisely what happened. And among the other things was the bloodbath of Pol Pot, almost inconceivable to mankind that happened. And a horrendous apocalypse awaits Ukraine if it is defeated. We all know that. We can all imagine what an occupied Ukraine is going to look like. So everyone who's listening, and we thank you for joining us. And if you have a question, please do ask. Thomas will get you.
Thank you so much. I just want to know if you could drop me down to speaker so that everybody else that has questions can speak. And thank you very much. If you could drop me down to listener, that would be great.
Okay, I'm sure that's being done by people who are a lot smarter than I am.
Actually, the funny part is I can't really do this without removing her, so you would have to drop down by yourself. But that's
Okay, I'm
actually
sorry. I'll do that now.
Not a problem.
Again, congratulations. Great, amazing space. And I wish you all the best of luck. And congratulations. Thank you for doing this. Danke. Merci beaucoup. Gracias.
Alrighty. Yeah, and yes, funny enough, it is still the first YouTube crossover Twitter space with video and audio, and it seems to be working. So we may have threaded that needle. Right here. Anything else? Let's wrap this up. Scott, one more thing. What's next this week? What do you expect this week to happen?
No, not really. Oh, okay. I expect to get some really interesting clues from the American administration as to how they're going to play this ceasefire, especially vis-a-vis Russia. And I think that will give our European friends, and most importantly, the Ukrainians, clues as to how they have to react for what they have to prepare. So I'm very curious about developments on that front. That's what I'll be mainly watching, although I hear from Ukrainian commanders that the transfer of Russian forces to Kursk leaves gaps on the sort of the Ukrainian territory and the Donbass especially. So there could be further counteroffensives, for which I'm very anxious in a good way, like positively see them, as earlier you and Chuck said, see the Ukrainians demolish the talking point that Ukraine can't make progress on the military. How about you, Chuck? What are you looking for this week?
I am anticipating more maximalist demands from Russia. I am seeing more Russian intransigence, and I am seeing people like Marco Rubio telling me that this is progress, that we have fully engaged with the Russians for a frank discussion that we look forward to actually coming to fruition. I'm looking forward to 2 weeks from now when Trump says something like, we're going to start enforcing sanctions the way they're supposed to be enforced. We are going to be conducting the qualification of the mariners who are manning your shadow tanker fleets. We are going to interdict those ships that are operating on the high seas as very large crude carriers that don't have insurance, that don't have the environmental protection equipment on them. And I think when that finally happens, it'll get Russia's attention, because in the meantime, they make $800 million a day busting sanctions. So we'll see.
All righty, good. Let's see what happens. I think the
you?
week will be.
How about you, Axel?
Enough,
what do you see?
But the end of the coming week, one thing is certain: we shall reconvene, and we will reconvene here. 3 men about in about everyone. It was a pleasure having a quick conversation here. Next time we may have one or the other topics prepared for you. Today was our first live run, and I think it was technically it was a success.
It was. And Thomas, behind the scenes, Thomas, folks from Denmark, is he put it together. Thank you, Thomas.
All righty. Cheerio.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.